Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 1783 eruption of the Laki volcano and its direct consequences for the French Revolution. With me today, I've got Aluong Jongkuch, Shivan Singh, and I am Alexander Murphy. And let's just dive right in. I believe Shivan has a question prepared for us.
Yes, so just to get us started, I'm just going to share this image of the overall scale of the actual volcano or the eruption. And just to start, I'd like to answer the question about how did this eruption affect the local population in Iceland, which is where it occurred, and were the effects here greater than those experienced in foreign countries like France? And just to understand why this was such a dangerous eruption, we have to first understand that this was a basaltic eruption, meaning that this occurred over a long period of time because it was low energy. So over, I think, a period of 8 months, it would release different sulfur content, sulfuric acid and sulfur dioxide, because it had a high silica content. And this led to acid rains, and it engulfed the entire island of Iceland immediately in a cloud of sulfur dioxide. The reason it became so widespread, as you can see here, is because the actual toxic gases and the ash made its way from the troposphere into the stratosphere, and it was taken over and spread across most of northern and western Europe, which is where they experienced this haze. And this led to various famines, both in Iceland and other parts of the world. And the problems were seen as far as China and Japan and even South Asia and Africa. In Iceland specifically, the issues were mainly agricultural, because a lot of the agricultural land was buried in as much as 20 meters of lava. And about 13,000 people died, or over 13,000 people, which is a large portion of Iceland's population. Some of the more, because this is such a visible effect in Iceland, and because the population was so small, there wasn't really major political issues in Iceland at the time, as the problems in France were a bit different. They did experience extreme famines, but it wasn't just a reduced population and lack of food. There was major political changes, and that's why the problems were sort of different in different parts of the world.
I think also to add on to Shivan's point is looking at the adversity and the significance on the population. First of all, you have to consider that Iceland's population was very small to begin with. And then taking 13% out of that had diverse effects on its population. But also looking at how these eruptions affected the climate, we first of all have to look at the time zone. The fact that the eruptions lasted 8 months, this meant that there was about 122 million tons of sulfur dioxide that was released into the atmosphere. And then also, because most of this aerosols were released into the upper troposphere, into the upper atmosphere, they got into the jet stream. And the jet stream are winds that travel from west to ends and between major air cells of the world. And these are cells that mainly govern the air circulation around the world. And because these winds travel at about 275 miles per hour, we could see the effects that were seen as far as not only Europe, we could also see effects in Africa and in China. And another thing to also consider is because of the large amount of aerosols that were released into the atmosphere, we saw that a reduce in the solar energy that was coming from the sun onto the earth. And this saw a very significant decrease in the average temperatures of the landmass of Eurasia by about 3 degrees. This in turn also affected the climate of other places like Africa, because a decrease in the temperatures of Eurasia saw a decrease in temperature balance in between Europe and Africa. And this affected the trade winds, like the monsoon trade winds in the Indian Ocean. And because the trade winds were affected, we see that there was less cloud cover in places like Africa and India. And also this significantly increased temperatures by about 1 degree and 2 degrees in Africa and India. And also a fun fact that I realized is that NASA also did some research into this, and they saw that during that time period, this was the only time that the waters of the River Nile were ever reduced. Yeah.
And Aluong, just to add to yours, I think you had a picture too to show us that.
Oh yeah, sorry, I almost forgot. Let me just share my screen to show the jet streams that I'm talking about. If you see on my screen, we have jet streams that are majorly flowing from west to east, and they're found in both hemispheres of the Earth. So we have the polar jet streams and the subtropical jet streams, and these are winds that are very traveling at about 275 miles per hour, as I said before.
Yeah, and I think the polar jet stream is what really spread it mainly to Europe.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, to build on what Aluong has said, so he touched on how it was sulfur dioxide that was just being pumped en masse into the atmosphere. Sulfur has a really interesting interaction with the biosphere. So sulfur directly inhibited plant reproduction, so it made it decrease the amount of seeds that were produced by a lot of plants. And additionally, the effects that he mentioned on the climate, such as decreasing temperatures in Northern Europe and Eurasia, really inhibited plant growth overall. And that actually brings us into how the Laki eruption directly affected the French Revolution. And so just a quick context building for French society at the time. So French society was, the French government at least, was burdened with a really high level of government debt. Just year to year, they had to spend a lot of money servicing this debt. So they had to raise taxes, and this affected the peasantry, the farmers, most of all, and they are not in a position to pay this because of what Aluong mentioned, of the decreases in plant growth and the temperature decreases. And they couldn't shift the tax burden onto the wealthier people because the wealthy comprised 2/3 of the government of the Estates General at the time. And this effectively meant that no taxes in France could be shifted away from the peasantry onto the nobility or the clergy, who might have been able to pay their taxes more effectively. And so eventually what this leads to is, because of all this unrest, the French government actually shut out the parliament. They were worried that they were going to face a general rising. So what this winds up leading to is an event called the Tennis Court Oath, where the Estates General, or the Third Estate, which represented 95% of the population, but 1/3 of the voting power in Parliament, literally goes to a tennis court because they've been shut out of their actual parliamentary building, and they swear not to rest, not to dissolve, until a proper French constitution is agreed upon that would alleviate some of these concerns.
Yeah, and just looking at this, I guess this image, they painted it, it occurred in Versailles, correct?
Yeah, it did occur in Versailles.
Yeah, and I think it was made up of mainly the new or rising middle class. And I think this is why eventually there was so many republics, because this middle class was another minority in the overall population. And I just thought that was an interesting point to look at, because just how all of this could affect France so heavily from something that happened so far away in Iceland.
I think what's really interesting about the Laki eruption overall is just the intense degree, and it's very obvious the ways that it just affected so many different levels of the Earth systems of interaction.
And just to add on that, we can explicitly see the different parts of the Earth systems interacting. First of all, we see the geosphere interacting with the atmosphere, whereby we have the eruptions, and the eruptions lead into the release of these aerosols into the atmosphere. This in turn affects the biosphere, whereby we see, because of the released aerosols into the atmosphere, sorry, my bad, we see a drop in the temperature. And this also directly affects the biosphere, if it's not the anthrosphere. Because of the decrease in the temperatures, we see a decrease in the harvests, and this directly affects the political scene of French to say.
Yeah, it just goes to show how delicate our overall Earth system is and how much we depend on all the different aspects of our world. Yeah.
That's true.
Well, I'd like to extend a thank you to both of my co-hosts for joining today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to our little spiel on various Earth system interactions. That has been our podcast on the French Revolution and the 1783 Laki eruption. Hope you learned something. Until next time, as they would say in France, au revoir.